It was a bright and bustling morning in Enchancia when Princess Sofia awoke to the sound of clattering pans and delightful smells drifting through the castle halls. At first, she thought Chef Andre was testing a new recipe, but when she followed the aroma down to the royal kitchen, she discovered something quite unusual. King Roland himself was wearing an apron dusted with flour and attempting to whisk eggs in a rather unkingly fashion. The sight was so surprising that Sofia burst into giggles, covering her mouth politely, but unable to hide her amusement. King Roland turned toward her with a sheepish grin, clearly enjoying himself despite his messy attempt at baking. "Father, what are you doing?" Sofia asked, stepping closer, careful not to slip on the trail of flour that had spread across the floor. "Well, my dear," King Roland replied proudly, "I've decided it's time to reconnect with something I loved when I was young. Back before I became king, I used to bake with my father. I wasn't very good at it then, but I always found joy in creating something with my own hands." Sofia tilted her head in thought. "So, you want to be a baker again?" "Not exactly," Roland chuckled, "but I want to prove to myself, and maybe to the whole kingdom, that a king can wear a crown and an apron at the same time. So, I've decided to enter the Royal Baking Festival." Sofia's eyes widened in excitement. The Royal Baking Festival was one of the biggest events in Enchancia, where bakers from all around the land gathered to showcase their skills. There were pies, pastries, cakes, and breads of every flavor imaginable, and winners received the coveted Golden Whisk Award. The idea of her father competing in such an event was both thrilling and hilarious. "But father," Sofia said carefully, "the bakers who enter are some of the best in the kingdom. They've been practicing for years. Do you really think you can win?" Roland crossed his arms, standing tall despite the smudge of flour on his nose. "That's exactly why I need to try. It's not about winning. It's about showing everyone that even a king can try something new, even if he makes a few mistakes along the way." Touched by his determination, Sofia smiled. "Then I'll help you. I may not know everything about baking, but I know a lot about never giving up." Together, they began their baking practice. Chef Andre was less than thrilled about the idea of the king taking over his kitchen. But with Sofia's encouragement, he reluctantly agreed to share his knowledge. The first few attempts were disasters: cakes that sank in the middle, bread that was too hard to chew, and cookies that came out burnt at the edges. But Roland laughed through it all, surprising everyone with his cheerful attitude. Sofia, meanwhile, worked hard to encourage him, reminding him of the same lessons she had learned during her many adventures as a princess, that patience, practice, and perseverance could lead to great things. By the end of the week, the king's skills had improved just enough that his creations were edible, and even tasty. He still had a long way to go, but Sofia believed in him. As the day of the festival drew closer, word spread quickly that King Roland himself would be competing. The entire kingdom buzzed with anticipation, eager to see how their ruler would fare in a contest usually reserved for common bakers. Some laughed at the thought, others cheered in support, but everyone agreed on one thing: this year's festival would be the most memorable in history. And so, the king prepared to step into the world of flour, sugar, and dough, not as a ruler, but as a humble baker with a big dream. The morning of the Royal Baking Festival dawned bright and golden, with the smell of fresh bread drifting from the town square. Sofia and her family rode in the royal carriage, but instead of wearing his usual kingly attire, Roland wore a simple baker's coat embroidered with the crest of Enchancia. Citizens gasped and waved, whispering in surprise and delight. The square had been transformed into a magical bakery wonderland. Long tables were lined with bowls, flour sacks, fruits, spices, and polished ovens. Flags fluttered in the breeze, and the golden whisk trophy shone on a pedestal, glittering under the sun. Bakers from across the land, some tall and stern, others cheerful and plump, stood ready with their teams, determined to prove their worth. Sofia noticed a few skeptical faces as they spotted the king. "He thinks being king makes him a baker," one murmured. Another whispered, "He'll never last the first round." Sofia frowned but squeezed her father's hand. "Ignore them, father. You're not here to prove anything to them. You're here for yourself." The announcer, a cheerful man with a booming voice, stepped forward. Welcome one and all to the annual Royal Baking Festival. Today bakers will face 3 rounds of challenges. The first, a classic bread bake. The second, a creative pastry display. And the final, a grand cake masterpiece. Excitement surged through the crowd as the bell rang for the first challenge. Roland, with Sofia by his side, studied the ingredients laid before him. The challenge was simple. Bake a loaf of bread that was soft, flavorful, and perfectly golden. Roland's confidence wavered as he saw the skilled bakers swiftly kneading dough with expert hands. His movements were clumsy in comparison, and flour puffed up into the air around him, but Sofia guided him gently. Remember, Father, patience. Don't rush the dough. Roland nodded, taking his time. He kneaded carefully, humming to calm his nerves. Soon his dough began to take shape. When it went into the oven, Sofia could only hope it would bake evenly. As the judges made their rounds, Roland watched nervously. They tasted bread after bread, nodding and jotting notes. Finally, they reached his table. The loaf looked decent, golden, though a little uneven. The judges sliced it open. Steam rose, and to Roland's surprise, they smiled. Not perfect, one said, but warm, soft, and full of heart. Remarkably good for a beginner. The crowd clapped politely, and Roland's face lit up. He had survived the first round. But Sofia knew the harder tests were still ahead. The second round of the Royal Baking Festival was announced with great fanfare, and this time the bakers were asked to create a tray of pastries, delicate, flavorful, and visually beautiful. The crowd roared in excitement, for this was always the most colorful part of the contest. Stalls filled with cream, berries, nuts, chocolate, and spices shimmered in the sunlight, and the smell of sugar filled the air. King Roland looked at the spread nervously. Bread had been simple enough, but pastries were another matter entirely. He had only practiced a few tarts with Sofia, and even those had looked more like lopsided pies than elegant pastries. His hands trembled as he sifted flour into a bowl. "Father, don't panic," Sofia whispered, standing close. "Remember what you told me when I first became a princess, that trying is more important than perfection." Roland inhaled deeply and nodded. "You're right, Sofia. Let's do this together." The competition began, and bakers around him moved like lightning, rolling dough thin as parchment, folding it with butter to create layers, filling shells with custards and jams. Roland clumsily rolled his dough, accidentally tearing it. His rivals smirked. One baker, a tall woman with perfect posture named Madame Gâteau, whispered loudly to another competitor, "This is hardly fit for a royal contest." Sofia's cheeks flushed, but she refused to let the words bother her. She encouraged her father, guiding him to repair the dough and try again. Instead of attempting fancy techniques, Roland decided to bake something simple but heartfelt: warm apple turnovers, inspired by the pies his own father had once made. As he chopped apples, Sofia suggested a sprinkle of cinnamon and honey. "It will taste like home," she said with a smile. Roland brightened and carefully folded the filling into his dough triangles. Though they looked uneven, the smell, too, that drifted from the oven was mouth-watering. When time was called, Roland placed his tray alongside dozens of dazzling pastries, swirls of cream, golden eclairs, perfect fruit tarts that gleamed like jewels. His turnovers looked plain in comparison. He braced himself for disappointment. The judges arrived. They admired the artistry of the other bakers first, then paused at Roland's humble tray. One judge raised a brow at the uneven shapes, but picked one up nonetheless. He took a bite, then his expression softened. "Not elegant," he admitted, "but the flavor. Warm, comforting, and made with care." Another nodded. "These remind me of my grandmother's baking." The crowd murmured in surprise. Though Roland's pastries were far from flawless, they carried something rare, heartfelt simplicity. The applause grew louder than he expected, and Sofia beamed. Madame Gâteau, however, frowned in annoyance. She had baked a tower of cream-filled eclairs that dazzled the crowd, but she could see that Roland's humble approach had touched the judges in a way her perfection had not. She turned away, muttering under her breath. Roland exhaled in relief. "We did it, Sofia. I may not be the most skilled baker, but at least I stayed true to myself." Sofia hugged him proudly, and that's what really matters. The round ended with Roland advancing to the final stage, though he remained near the bottom of the leaderboard. Still, the crowd's respect for him grew, and Sofia noticed more and more cheers rising for the king who bakes like a friend. But in the corner of the festival grounds, Madame Gâteau watched closely, her eyes narrowing. She had worked too hard to let a king's charm overshadow her talent, and she was already scheming ways to ensure that Roland would stumble in the next round. The competition had grown fiercer, and Sofia sensed that the challenges ahead would test more too, and just her father's baking. The next morning the tension in the air was palpable. The final round loomed, the grand cake challenge. But before that, there was a surprise mini-test announced, a quick-fire bake-off, where participants had to create a batch of cookies in under an hour. It was meant to test adaptability under pressure, and Roland's face went pale at the announcement. Cookies seemed simple enough, but baking under such strict time limits was a daunting task for someone still learning. Sofia squeezed his hand. "We've come this far, Father. We can do this." Roland set to work, measuring flour and sugar. Sofia helped him remember the proportions they had practiced, but as he reached for the vanilla extract, he noticed the bottle was missing. His eyes darted around, and he spotted Madame Gâteau smirking from her table, her own bottle of vanilla sitting boldly in front of her. 2 bottles, in fact. Sofia gasped softly. "She took ours." Roland frowned but shook his head. "No matter. We'll adapt." Instead of vanilla, he reached for a jar of orange zest and a sprinkle of nutmeg. Sofia's eyes lit up. That could actually be delicious. They hurried to finish, rolling the dough and cutting shapes. But halfway through baking, another disaster struck. The oven door jammed, and smoke began to billow. Sofia quickly called for help, and Cedric the royal sorcerer, who had come to watch the festival, muttered a fixing spell. The oven creaked back into place just in time for Roland's cookies to finish baking, though they were slightly uneven. When presented to the judges, Roland explained honestly, "We lost our vanilla, so I improvised with citrus and spice." The judges took careful bites. Their eyes widened in pleasant surprise. "Unexpected," one said, "but creative. A delightful twist on a classic cookie." The crowd applauded again, and Roland's confidence grew. Sofia, however, kept her gaze on Ma, Dame Gâteau, who looked annoyed that her trick hadn't worked. Later, during a short break, Sofia whispered to her father, "She's trying to sabotage you." Roland sighed but smiled gently. "Perhaps. But we mustn't stoop to that level. If we bake with honesty, we'll always win in the ways that matter." His words calmed Sofia, though she still watched Madame Gâteau warily. That evening, back at the castle, Sofia reflected on the day. She realized that her father wasn't just competing to bake, he was teaching her, and the whole kingdom, a valuable lesson about fairness, resilience, and heart. The stage was set for the grand finale, and though challenges remained, Sofia felt certain that no matter the outcome, her father had already proven himself in the most important way. The day of the grand finale dawned bright, with banners fluttering high and the golden whisk gleaming on its pedestal. The final challenge was announced. Each baker would create a towering cake that represented something meaningful to them. It was the ultimate test of skill, creativity, and heart. Roland felt the weight of the task. He glanced around at the other bakers already sketching elaborate designs. Some planned castles of sugar, others cascading waterfalls of chocolate. Roland, however, was unsure. "What should I make, Sofia?" he whispered nervously. Sofia smiled warmly. "What means the most to you, Father? If your cake tells your story, it will shine." Roland thought for a long moment, then nodded. "Family," he said firmly. "That's what matters most." He began carefully preparing layers of vanilla sponge infused with cinnamon and apple, flavors that reminded him of baking with his father long ago. As he worked, however, something unexpected happened. The baker beside him,
A young man named Hugo suddenly dropped his bowl of batter, splattering the floor. To make matters worse, his oven broke down, leaving him in tears. The poor baker looked ready to quit. Roland paused, glancing at his own cake still in progress. He turned to Sofia. "If I help him, I may not finish mine in time." Sofia's eyes softened. "Do what you think is right." Without hesitation, Roland offered Hugo his spare mixing bowl and let him share his oven. The crowd gasped at the king's generosity, and Sofia beamed with pride. Hugo, though shy, whispered a heartfelt thank you. Roland's own cake ended up smaller and less polished than others, but Hugo's was saved. Roland decorated his with simple touches, caramel drizzles, sugared apples, and a family crest made of icing. It looked plain compared to the towering sugar castles around him, but it carried his heart. When the judges asked about
But his creation, Roland explained simply, "My cake is about family. Family means helping one another, even when it costs you something." The judges nodded with respect, their faces serious yet warm. Though Roland's cake wasn't the tallest or the fanciest, it radiated sincerity. The crowd erupted into cheers, chanting, "The Baker King! The Baker King!" Madame Gâteau, watching from the other side of the arena, scowled. Her cake was perfect in every technical detail, yet she could feel the audience's affection leaning toward Roland. She realized his humility and kindness were winning hearts in a way her perfection could not. As the sun dipped low and the smell of sugar filled the square, Sofia squeezed her father's hand. "You showed me today that baking is more than flour and sugar. It's about kindness, too." Roland smiled, tired but proud. "And that's a lesson I'll never forget." The final judging was still to come, but in the hearts of the people, Roland had already won something greater than a trophy. The festival square glistened with excitement as the judges prepared for the ultimate tasting. All the cakes, grand towers of chocolate, fountains of caramel, delicate spun sugar sculptures, stood ready on decorated tables. Roland's cake, smaller and humbler, rested proudly among them, its sugared apples gleaming like jewels. Sofia's heart raced as the judges began their tour. They marveled at the artistry of Madame Gâteau's towering creation, a replica of the Enchancia castle, sculpted entirely from cake and sugar. The crowd gasped at its perfection, some whispering, "Surely she will win." When the judges reached Roland's table, the crowd fell silent. His cake looked almost ordinary beside the others. Roland cleared his throat. "This cake may not be grand, but it carries the flavors of family and the spirit of helping others." The judges sliced it carefully. Steam rose, releasing the warm scent of apple, cinnamon, and honey. They tasted, their expressions softening. "Simple," one judge said thoughtfully, "but filled with heart." Another judge added, "This cake tells a story. It isn't just food, it is memory and love." The audience cheered loudly. Roland smiled, glancing at Sofia, who gave him an encouraging nod. Yet tension hung in the air as the judges whispered among themselves, balancing perfection against sincerity. Finally, the chief judge stepped forward. "This year's Golden Whisk Award goes to Madame Gâteau for her unmatched artistry and flawless execution." The crowd applauded politely, though many looked disappointed. Madame Gâteau lifted the trophy high, beaming triumphantly, yet her eyes flickered uneasily toward Roland, whose cheers from the crowd outshone her victory. The judge raised a hand for silence. "And this year, we present a new honor, the Heart of Baking Medal, awarded to the baker who showed courage, kindness, and true spirit." He turned to Roland. "Your Majesty, you are the Baker King." The crowd erupted, louder than ever before. Children waved wooden spoons like scepters. Bakers clapped with respect, and chants of Baker King, echoed through the square. Roland bowed humbly, tears in his eyes. "Thank you. This means more to me than any crown." Sofia hugged him tightly. "I'm so proud of you, Father." Though Madame Gâteau had won the golden whisk, it was Roland who won the kingdom's heart. When the festival ended, the kingdom of Enchancia buzzed with excitement for weeks. People spoke not only of Madame Gâteau's towering sugar castle, but even more of their king, who had dared to try, stumbled, learned, and baked with love. In the castle, Roland returned to his royal duties, but something had changed. He continued baking on weekends, often with Sofia by his side. They invited the castle staff to taste their creations. Sometimes successes, sometimes disasters, but always joyful. Bailiwick once joked, "Your Majesty, you may not always rule the kitchen, but you do rule our hearts." Sofia noticed that Roland had grown more humble since the festival. He listened more, laughed more, and encouraged others to try new things, no matter how difficult. His courage inspired nobles and villagers alike. Bakers from across Enchancia began teaching their craft to children, saying, "If the king can try, so can you." One day a group of young apprentices visited the castle to present Roland with a gift, a wooden plaque carved with the words, "The Baker King." Roland hung it proudly in the kitchen, smiling whenever he saw it. Though he hadn't won the golden whisk, Roland realized he had gained something far greater, a legacy of humility and courage. His story reminded everyone that trying mattered more than triumph, and kindness mattered more than perfection. As for Sofia, she cherished the memory of baking alongside her father. She had always admired him as a king, but now she admired him even more as a person who wasn't afraid to fail. She learned that true strength lay not in crowns or trophies, but in the willingness to grow and the courage to share kindness. Years later, the story of the festival would still be told across Enchancia. Children acted out plays of the Baker King, villagers baked apple turnovers on feast days, and families repeated Roland's lesson. Family means helping one another, even when it cost you something. And every time Sofia smelled cinnamon and apples baking in the oven, she smiled, remembering the festival that had changed her father forever. King Roland may not have been the best baker, but in the hearts of his people, he would always be their Baker King.